The wagon wheels groaned against the dusty main street of Prosperity Creek as dawn broke over the prairie. 1869 had brought change to the Colorado Territory. The scent of sagebrush mingled with coal smoke, and the distant mountains stood dark blue against the lightening sky, their peaks still capped with snow even as summer approached. Eleanor Whitfield stood at the window of her father's bank, watching the town wake. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, trying to steady her breathing. The morning light revealed what everyone in town already knew: the Whitfield Bank was failing. The grand building that had once symbolized prosperity now felt like a tomb. "Eleanor," her father's voice cracked from across the room. Thomas Whitfield had aged 10 years in the past month, his once proud shoulders now bent under the weight of his debts. "Judge Morrison will be here soon." She turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his watery blue ones. They both knew what was coming. The failed mining venture, the one that was supposed to make them wealthy beyond measure, had instead buried them in debt so deep they couldn't see daylight. The judge arrived precisely at 8, his black coat making him look like a vulture descending on carrion. Elias Morrison had the kind of face that never smiled, carved from the same unforgiving stone as the mountains themselves. Behind him, the sheriff waited, hand resting on his pistol, a reminder that the law had teeth in Prosperity Creek. "Whitfield," the judge began without preamble, settling into the leather chair across from Thomas's desk. "You owe me $30,000. The mine produced nothing but dirt and broken promises." Thomas's hands trembled as he spread them on the desk. "I need more time." "Time?" Morrison's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "You've had 6 months. I could seize this bank today, throw you and your daughter into the street." Eleanor stepped forward, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her veins. "There must be another way." The judge's eyes, cold as river stones, fixed on her. A slow, calculating look crossed his face. "Perhaps there is." He leaned back, fingers steepled. "You have a daughter of marriageable age, pretty enough, educated. She could fetch a good match back east." "Eleanor is not for sale," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Everything is for sale. Whitfield, but I'm not interested in selling her." Morrison stood, walking to the window. Outside, the town was fully awake now, horses tied to hitching posts, women in calico dresses hurrying past, the saloon already accepting its first customers of the day. "She'll marry one of my servants, the stable hand. I think Samuel Hawkins." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She'd seen Samuel around town, a tall, broad-shouldered man who kept his eyes down and his mouth shut. His hands were permanently stained from leather and horse sweat, his clothes patched and repatched. He couldn't even read the signs posted on the storefronts. "You can't be serious," she whispered. "Deadly serious." Morrison turned back to them. "A Whitfield married to a servant. It will remind this town that debts must be paid, that no one is above the law or above me. Do this, and I'll give you 6 months to pay half the debt. Refuse, and I take everything today." Eleanor looked at her father, saw the defeat in his eyes. She thought of her mother, dead these 3 years, who had always held her head high even when the ranch family snubbed them at church. What would she think of her daughter now? "Papa," she said softly, but Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes. "What say you, Miss Whitfield?" Morrison pressed. "Marriage to a servant, or watch your father hang for his debts." The words seemed to echo in the room. Outside, she heard the whispers starting news traveled fast in Prosperity Creek. By noon, everyone would know. Forced to marry a servant as punishment, what followed changed everything. They'd say over their whiskey and gossip. Eleanor's throat felt dry as desert sand. She thought of her dreams a proper marriage, perhaps to the doctor's son or one of the cavalry officers at the fort. Not this, never this. But the alternative was worse. She'd seen what happened to men who couldn't pay their debts out here. The law was harsh, and Judge Morrison's law was harsher still. "I'll do it," she said, the words falling like stones from her lips. Morrison smiled, a thin, satisfied thing. "The wedding will be tomorrow. In the church. I want the whole town to witness it." Samuel Hawkins was summoned within the hour. Eleanor watched him enter the bank, his large frame filling the doorway. He removed his worn hat, revealing dark hair that needed cutting. His face was weathered from sun and wind, making him look older than his 30 years. When their eyes met, she expected to see triumph or greed. Instead, she found only wariness. "You're to marry Miss Whitfield," Morrison informed him bluntly. "Do this, and I'll give you that patch of land by Willow Creek. Refuse, and find work elsewhere if anyone will hire you after crossing me." Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked at Eleanor again, and she saw something she didn't expect: pity. It stung worse than scorn would have. "If Miss Whitfield agrees," he said finally, his voice deeper than she'd expected, rough from disuse. "I won't force anyone." "She's already agreed," Morrison said dismissively. "Tomorrow, noon. Wear something clean." After the men left, Eleanor sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. The shame of it burned in her chest like acid. Tomorrow, she would stand before the town and marry a man who smelled of horses and couldn't write his own name. The gossips would feast on it for months. The wedding day dawned cloudy, moisture in the air promising rain that would never come. The small church smelled of pine resin and old hymn books. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress. She'd had to take it in, having lost weight from worry. The ivory silk felt like mockery against her skin. Samuel waited at the altar, uncomfortable in a borrowed black coat that pulled tight across his shoulders. He'd tried to tame his hair, she noticed, though a stubborn piece still stuck up at the back. His hands, she saw, were scrubbed raw. The stains hadn't come out, but he'd tried. The church was packed. Morrison sat in the front row like a king at court, satisfied with his justice. The townspeople whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes bright with scandal. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed ahead, her bouquet of wildflowers, the only flowers Samuel could afford, trembling in her grip. Reverend Thompson read the vows quickly, as if eager to be done with the farce. When he asked if anyone objected, the silence stretched so long, Eleanor almost laughed. Of course no one would object. This was Morrison's will, and in Prosperity Creek, that was as good as God's. "I do," she said when prompted, the words barely audible. "I do," Samuel echoed, steady and clear. They didn't kiss. Morrison hadn't demanded that particular humiliation. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor caught her reflection in the church window. She looked like a ghost, pale, ethereal, already fading. Behind them, the whispers rose like a tide. The wedding feast was a sorry affair of cornbread and beans at the saloon. Eleanor sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of every sound he made eating, every shift of his large body. He tried to use his fork properly, she noticed, though it was clear he was more comfortable with his hands. As the sun set, painting the desert red as rust, Samuel finally spoke to her directly. "We should go," he said quietly. "Long ride to the homestead." "The homestead? Her new home?" Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The cabin sat beside a creek that was more suggestion than water this late in summer. Samuel had built it himself, he told her as they approached logs chinked with mud. A stone chimney, a door that hung straight. It was tiny compared to her father's house. Just one room with a loft. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and leather. A narrow bed sat against one wall, a table with 2 chairs against another. Everything was clean but sparse, functional. This was her life now. Samuel set down her trunk, the one piece of her old life she'd been allowed to bring. He straightened, seemed about to speak, then moved to the fireplace instead. The silence stretched between them as he built up the fire. Finally, he turned to her. "The bed is yours," he said simply. "I'll sleep by the fire." Eleanor blinked, surprised. But we're married. By law. Maybe, not by choice. He met her eyes directly for the first time since the ceremony. I won't force anything on you. Mrs. Hawkins, you've been forced enough already. The unexpected kindness undid her. Tears she'd held back all day finally spilled over. She turned away, embarrassed. But Samuel just quietly laid out blankets by the hearth and settled down with his back to her. Eleanor lay in the narrow bed, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams. Outside, she could hear the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie night coyotes howling in the distance, insects chirping, the wind rustling through grass. In town, there had been the comfort of other houses nearby, gaslight on the streets. Here, there was only darkness and the small circle of light from the dying fire. She thought about the whispers that would follow her name now. The banker's daughter who fell so low she married a servant. The punishment for her father's greed. Tomorrow, she would have to face this new life drawing water from the creek, cooking over an open fire, living with a man she didn't know and didn't want to know. But as she listened to Samuel's steady breathing across the room, a small, treacherous thought crept in. He had shown her kindness when he didn't have to. He had given her space, dignity, choice small gifts in a situation that had stripped her of all three. Perhaps this punishment wouldn't be the hell she'd imagined. Perhaps it would simply be endurance. As sleep finally claimed her, the last thing she heard was a log settling in the fireplace, sending up a shower of sparks like small stars in the darkness. The first morning came too soon. Eleanor woke to the sound of Samuel moving quietly around the cabin, trying not to disturb her. Through the small window, she could see the sky turning from black to deep purple, stars fading like dying embers. She watched from beneath her blanket as he built up the fire, his movements efficient and practiced. He filled the coffee pot from a bucket of water, set it on the iron spider over the flames. The simple domesticity of it made her chest tight. This was her life now, watching a stranger perform the morning rituals in what was supposed to be her home. "Morning," he said without turning, somehow knowing she was awake. Eleanor sat up, pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "Good morning." He gestured to the table where he'd set out cornbread and molasses. "It's not much. I usually just have coffee, but—" He trailed off. Uncomfortable. "It's fine," she said quickly, though her stomach turned at the thought of food. They ate in silence, the space between them filled with all the words they didn't know how to say. Eleanor noticed how he held his coffee cup carefully, as if afraid he might break it. His hands were scarred from work, one finger slightly crooked from an old break. After breakfast, Samuel stood. "I'll show you the land, if you'd like. You should know what's yours now. Asterisk yours. Asterisk." The word sat strangely in her mind. Nothing felt like hers anymore. They walked the boundaries of the small plot, Samuel pointing out landmarks, the white boulder that marked the eastern edge, the stand of cottonwoods to the north. The creek that gave the land its only real value ran shallow but clear, whispering over stones worn smooth by time. "Spring brings it up higher," Samuel explained, kneeling to run his hand through the water. "Enough to irrigate if we're careful. The soil's good here, sandy loam. We'll grow corn, beans, squash." Eleanor watched him speak about the land and realized this was the most she'd ever heard him say. His voice changed when he talked about soil and water, becoming sure, almost gentle. He showed her tracks in the mud deer, rabbit, the delicate prints of birds. "You know this land well," she observed. He glanced at her, then away. "Land doesn't judge, doesn't care if you can read or write, just cares if you treat it right." They continued walking, Samuel pointing out a prairie dog town, a hawk's nest in a dead pine, the place where wild onions grew. Eleanor found herself listening despite her determination to remain aloof. He spoke about the land like others spoke about books, with reverence and deep understanding. Back at the cabin, the day's reality set in. Water needed hauling. Meals needed cooking. Clothes needed washing. Eleanor stared at the bucket by the door, having never drawn water in her life. "I'll do it," Samuel said, reaching for the bucket. "No," the word came out sharper than intended. "I need to learn." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Creek's slippery. Watch your footing." The bucket was heavier than she expected when full. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking her skirt as she struggled up the bank. Her expensive boots, utterly unsuitable for this life, slipped on the wet stones. By the time she made it back to the cabin, she'd spilled half the water and her arms burned from the effort. Samuel didn't comment on the puddle by the door or her muddy hem. He simply took the bucket, poured what remained into the water barrel, and handed it back. "Takes practice," was all he said. That evening, Eleanor made her first attempt at cooking over the open fire. The cornbread burned on one side, stayed raw on the other. The beans were somehow both scorched and crunchy. Samuel ate without complaint, though she saw him discreetly pocket some of the worst burned pieces to dispose of later. "Tomorrow I go to town," he said as they sat by the fire after dinner. "You could come, get supplies, see your father." "No." Eleanor stared into the flames. The thought of facing the townspeople, their knowing looks and whispered judgments, made her stomach clench. What will people say, seeing me there, the banker's daughter fallen so low? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "People say lots of things. Doesn't make them true." She laughed bitterly. "Doesn't it? I am married to a—" She caught herself, but the words hung in the air anyway. "A servant," he finished calmly. "A man who works with his hands, who can't read the newspaper or sign his name proper." He poked at the fire with a stick. "Sending up sparks? That's what I am, but it's not all I am." Eleanor felt shame heat her cheeks. "I didn't mean—" "You did." His voice held no anger, just quiet certainty. "And you're not wrong, but maybe—" He stood, moving to the small shelf where he kept a few personal items. He pulled down something wrapped in oilcloth, handled it carefully as he returned to the fire. Inside was a piece of wood, carved into the shape of a running horse. The detail was extraordinary, every muscle defined, mane and tail seeming to flow with movement even in stillness. It was beautiful. "You made this," Eleanor breathed. He nodded, turning it in the firelight. "Can't read words, but I can read wood. Know where it wants to split, where it's strong. Each piece tells you what it wants to be, if you listen." She reached for it, and he placed it carefully in her hands. The wood was smooth as silk, warm from his touch. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "You could sell these." "Maybe." He took it back, rewrapping it carefully. "But then it'd just be work. Some things should stay just for the doing of them." That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she thought about Samuel's words, about reading wood instead of words, about things having value beyond what others assigned them. Outside, a screech owl called, its trembling notes carrying across the prairie, from his place by the fire. She heard Samuel shift, adding another log to keep the cabin warm. The next days fell into a rhythm. Morning coffee, the struggle with daily chores, evening meals by the fire. Eleanor's hands blistered from the washboard. Her back ached from bending over the cooking pot, but gradually, incrementally, she learned. Samuel helped when she'd accepted, stayed back when pride made her refuse. He never mocked her failures, the bread that could have served as a doorstop. The time she forgot to cover the rain barrel and found it full of mosquito larvae. He simply showed her, patient as the land itself, how to do better next time. One evening, as they sat in their customary silence, Eleanor surprised herself by speaking. "Why did you agree to it? The marriage?" Samuel looked up from the harness he was mending. "Judge Morrison's not a man you say no to." But the land, was it worth this? He set down the leather, considering, been working other men's land my whole life, sleeping in their barns, eating their leavings, the chance at my own peace. He shrugged. Maybe I'm no better than your father, trading what shouldn't be traded for a chance at something more. You're nothing like my father, Eleanor said fiercely, surprising them both. Samuel studied her across the fire. You defending me now? She felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm simply stating a fact. You work for what you have. He gambled with what wasn't just his to lose. We all gamble, Samuel said quietly, just with different stakes. A week later, news came from town. One of the ranch hands stopped by, looking for stray cattle. He shared the gossip eagerly. Judge Morrison was surveying land for a railway spur, buying up plots cheap from desperate farmers. The debt that had forced Eleanor's marriage was just one piece of a larger game. Your father's struggling, the ranch hand added, not unkindly. Bank's barely holding on. Some say Morrison's just waiting to take it all. After he left, Eleanor sat heavily on the porch step Samuel had built. It was all planned, she said dully. My father's debt, our marriage, Morrison's using us to scare others into selling cheap. Samuel sat beside her, careful to leave space between them. Probably. Doesn't that make you angry? He picked up a stick, began stripping the bark with his thumbnail. Being angry at men like Morrison is like being angry at winter. They're going to do what they do. You can rage at the cold, or you can build a better fire. Is that what we're doing? Eleanor asked. Building a fire. Samuel glanced at her, and for a moment she saw something warm flicker in his dark eyes. Maybe, he said, one stick at a time. That evening, as Samuel worked on another carving a bird, this time Eleanor made a decision that would change everything between them. Samuel, she said, her voice carefully steady, if I taught you to read, would you want to learn? His hands stilled on the wood. The fire crackled between them, filling the silence. When he looked up, she saw fear and hope warring in his expression. Why would you do that? Eleanor thought of her mother, who had believed education was the great equalizer, who had taught the Mexican children in town when no one else would. Because knowledge shouldn't be hoarded, she said. Because you read the land and wood and weather better than anyone I've met. Maybe it's time you could read words too. Samuel set down his carving, ran a hand through his hair. I'm 30 years old. My hands are made for work, not holding a pencil. Your hands made that. Eleanor pointed to the half-finished bird. They can learn to make letters too. He was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then, so soft she almost missed it. If you're willing to try teaching, I'm willing to try learning. Eleanor rose, went to her trunk, and pulled out her mother's slate, one of the few things she'd insisted on bringing. Tomorrow, she decided. They would begin. Tomorrow. She would give him what Judge Morrison and men like him feared most, the power of words. As she returned to the fire, slate in hand, she caught Samuel looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Gratitude. Yes, but something else too, something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with shame or duty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the fire dance, but inside the small cabin, for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor felt something other than despair. It was small, fragile as a new match flame, but it was there. Hope. The slate sat between them on the rough wooden table, cleaned and ready. Eleanor had written the alphabet across the top in her neat schoolteacher's hand. Samuel stared at the letters like they might bite him. We'll start simple, Eleanor said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Just A, B, and C today? Samuel picked up the chalk, holding it awkwardly between fingers more used to gripping reins or axe handles. The chalk looked impossibly small in his large hand. When he tried to copy the letter A, it came out crooked, one leg longer than the other. He set down the chalk, frustration clear on his face. This is foolish. These hands weren't made for such delicate work. These hands carved a horse so real I expected it to run, Eleanor countered. Writing is just another kind of carving. You're shaping meaning instead of wood. That made him pause. He picked up the chalk again, this time holding it more like he might hold a small knife. The next day was better, still rough, but recognizable. Eleanor had expected teaching to be straightforward. She knew her letters. He needed to learn them. But she quickly discovered that Samuel's mind worked differently than hers. He couldn't simply memorize shapes. Instead, she had to tie each letter to something he knew. A is like a tent, she found herself saying, or a ladder leaning against a barn. B is a snowman, 2 round parts stacked. C is a moon when it's not quite full. Samuel nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. Like reading tracks, he murmured. Each mark means something. They worked until the candle burned low, Samuel filling the slate with letters that gradually grew more confident. When they finally stopped, his hand was cramped and there was chalk dust in the creases of his palms. But he was smiling, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his weathered face. "Tomorrow we'll do 3 more, Eleanor said, carefully cleaning the slate. "Tomorrow," he agreed, and the word held a promise. The days fell into a new rhythm. Morning chores, then lessons at the table. Eleanor discovered that Samuel learned best when they connected letters to his world. D was a bow pulled tight. E was a pitchfork missing a tine. F was a branding iron. But it was when they moved to words that Samuel truly came alive. Eleanor started with the basics: horse, water, fire, land, words that lived in his hands and heart. She watched him sound them out, lips moving carefully around each letter, and felt a pride that surprised her. "Horse," he read one evening, running his finger under the letters. Horse. He looked up at her, wonder clear on his face. "I can see it. The word, it's not just marks anymore." Eleanor found herself blinking back tears. "Yes, that's exactly it." As autumn crept across the prairie, turning the grass golden and bringing cool nights, their lessons expanded. Samuel had an extraordinary memory for stories. He could recite entire passages he'd heard years ago, word for word. Eleanor realized he'd been storing language all his life, just waiting for the key to unlock it on the page. She wrote out the stories he knew, and he read them back, delighted to see familiar words in physical form. The Tortoise and the Hare became his first full reading, sounded out laboriously but with growing confidence. "Slow and steady wins the race," he read, then laughed a rich, warm sound Eleanor was hearing more often. "Guess that's me," then the tortoise learning his letters. "You're faster than you think," Eleanor said. "Most children take years to read this well. You've done it in weeks." He ducked his head, pleased but embarrassed by the praise. Eleanor found herself charmed by his modesty, so different from the boastful men she'd known in town. The lessons changed them both. As Samuel gained confidence with words, he spoke more freely. He told her about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to cholera, about working his way west with nothing but strong hands and determination. In return, Eleanor shared her own stories: her mother's death, her father's slow descent into risky investments, her own dreams of attending the teacher's college in Denver, dreams that had died with her marriage. "You're teaching now," Samuel pointed out one evening. They were sitting closer together these days, the space between them shrinking naturally. Maybe not in a schoolhouse, but teaching all the same. Eleanor considered this. "One student hardly makes me a teacher." One student who couldn't tell A from Z a month ago and now reads sentences. He met her eyes directly. "Seems like teaching to me." The first test of Samuel's new skills came unexpectedly. A letter arrived from town, not for Eleanor, but for Samuel. His hands shook slightly as he took it from the mail carrier. "It's from Judge Morrison," the carrier said helpfully. "Something about your land taxes." After the man left, Samuel stared at the envelope. In the past, he would have had to take it to someone else, reveal his ignorance, trust their honesty in reading it. Now, "You can do this," Eleanor said quietly. Samuel broke the seal, unfolded the paper. His lips moved as he worked through the formal language, finger tracking each line. Eleanor watched his face change as understanding dawned. "He's trying to raise the taxes," Samuel said slowly. "3 times what they were, due in 30 days, or..." He looked up at Eleanor. "Or he can seize the land for non-payment." Eleanor felt cold anger settle in her chest. "He's doing this to everyone who won't sell to him. My father mentioned it before." She trailed off, not wanting to revisit that painful last conversation. "But I can read it now," Samuel said, wonder mixing with anger in his voice. "I know what he's trying to do. Before, I would have just seen official paper and fancy words and believed whatever someone told me it said." They spent the evening composing a response, Samuel laboriously copying Eleanor's draft in his improving handwriting. It was a simple letter, formally protesting the tax increase and requesting a hearing. But it was Samuel's first letter, written in his own hand, signed with his own name, not an X, but Samuel Hawkins in careful, proud letters. The night they finished the letter, the first real cold snap hit. Wind howled around the cabin, finding every tiny gap in the chinking. They built up the fire, but the cold seemed to press in from all sides. "Winter's coming early," Samuel observed, adding another log to the fire. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, moving her chair closer to the warmth, without really thinking about it. Samuel shifted his own chair so his broad frame blocked the worst of the draft from reaching her. It was a small gesture, unconscious, but it made Eleanor's heart contract with an emotion she wasn't ready to name. They worked on reading the Bible that night, not from any particular devotion, but because it was one of the few books in the cabin. Samuel was determined to read the Christmas story by December, to prove to himself he could. And there were in the same country shepherds abiding in the field. He read slowly, keeping watch over their flock by night. Eleanor found herself watching his face in the firelight rather than following along in the text. The concentration in his expression, the way his brow furrowed over difficult words. The satisfaction when he conquered a particularly challenging passage. When had these things become so dear to her? "Eleanor," Samuel's voice broke her reverie. "Is this right? Glory to God in the highest." "Yes," she said softly. "That's perfect." He smiled, that increasingly common expression that never failed to warm her more than the fire. "Never thought I'd be reading scripture. My ma would be pleased. She always wanted her children educated. But after the sickness," he shrugged. "Life had other plans." "Life often does," Eleanor agreed, thinking of her own altered path. Samuel closed the Bible carefully, running his hand over the worn leather cover. "Do you regret it teaching me?" "No," Eleanor said immediately. "Do you regret learning?" He shook his head. "Changes everything, doesn't it, knowing how to read? Like I've been seeing the world through dirty glass, and now it's clean." He paused, glanced at her. "Do you regret the rest?" Eleanor knew what he was asking. Did she regret the marriage, the cabin, the life so different from what she'd planned a month ago? The answer would have been immediate. Now. "I regret how it happened," she said carefully. "I regret my father's choices that led us here, but..." She looked around the small cabin at the slate on the table, the carved animals on the shelf, the man across from her who had shown her more genuine kindness than she'd known in years. "I don't regret where here is anymore." Samuel's breath caught audibly. In the firelight, Eleanor could see hope dawn in his eyes, tentative but real. Outside, the wind howled louder, and the first flakes of snow began to fall. But inside the cabin, with the fire crackling and the Bible closed between them, Eleanor felt warmer than she had in months. "Tomorrow we'll start on newspapers," she said, voice slightly unsteady. The real test of reading small print and big words. Tomorrow. Samuel agreed. And this time the word held more than just promise. It held possibility. As they prepared for bed still in their separate spaces, but the distance feeling less like a gulf and more like a bridge yet to be crossed, Eleanor realized something had shifted. The shame that had weighed on her since her wedding day was lifting, replaced by something lighter. Pride, perhaps, or hope. Or maybe, just maybe, the first stirrings of love. Winter arrived with a vengeance. The snow that had started as gentle flakes became a howling wall of white, burying the prairie in drifts that reached the cabin windows. The temperature plummeted until the water in the wash basin froze solid overnight. Eleanor woke to a cabin so cold she could see her breath. The fire had died to embers, and frost painted delicate patterns on the inside of the windows. She pulled her blanket tighter, listening to the wind shriek around the corners of their small home. Samuel was already up, breaking ice in the water barrel with the handle of his axe. "Storm set in proper," he said, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Could last days. I need to check the animals, make sure they're sheltered." "I'll help," Eleanor said, climbing from bed despite the cold that bit through her nightgown. "No need. I said I'll help." She was already reaching for her warmest dress. "We're in this together, aren't we?" Something shifted in Samuel's expression. "Aye," he said softly. "We are." They worked side by side in the howling storm, stringing rope between the cabin and the lean-to where their 2 horses and milk cow sheltered. Samuel had learned this trick in other winters in a whiteout. That rope might be the only way to find their way back. Eleanor's hands went numb despite her mittens as they hauled water and spread extra straw. The animals pressed close together for warmth, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. By the time they stumbled back to the cabin, Eleanor couldn't feel her feet. "Sit," Samuel ordered, guiding her to a chair by the fire he'd built up to roaring. He knelt before her, unlacing her boots with gentle efficiency. "City boots," he muttered. "Pretty, but no good for prairie winter." Eleanor's feet were white with cold. Samuel wrapped them in a blanket, then shocked her by pulling them into his lap, rubbing them carefully to restore circulation. The intimacy of the gesture, her feet in his hands. His focused care made her breath catch for reasons that had nothing to do with cold. "Thank you," she whispered when feeling returned in painful prickles. He glanced up at her, and for a moment something electric passed between them. Then he carefully set her feet down, cleared his throat. "I'll make coffee. Warm us from the inside." They spent the storm-locked days in enforced closeness. Samuel read aloud from the newspapers they had, practicing on the small print while Eleanor mended clothes by the fire. She taught him to write not just letters, but words with flow and connection. He taught her how to read the storm when it might break, what the different sounds of wind meant. On the 3rd night, the cold was so intense that even the roaring fire couldn't keep it at bay. Eleanor woke shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard she feared they might crack. "Eleanor," Samuel's voice came from near the fire. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," she managed through chattering teeth. She heard him moving in the dark, then felt the weight of his blanket added to hers. "No," she protested. "You'll freeze." "I'm used to cold." But she could hear the shiver in his voice, too. They lay in their separate spaces, both pretending not to be cold, both failing. Finally, Samuel spoke into the darkness. "This is foolish. We'll freeze apart when we could be warm together." Eleanor's heart hammered. She knew what he was suggesting was practical, even necessary, but it would cross a line they'd carefully maintained since their wedding day. "Just for warmth," Samuel added quietly. "Nothing more. I give you my word." Eleanor thought of her mother, of propriety, of all the rules that govern decent behavior. Then she thought of freezing to death for the sake of those rules. "All right," she whispered. Samuel brought his blanket and settled beside her on the narrow bed. careful to maintain space between them. But body heat has its own gravity. Slowly, inevitably. They moved closer, until Eleanor's back was pressed against Samuel's chest, his arm carefully draped over the blankets covering her. Warmth seeped into her bones. Samuel was like a furnace, radiating heat that chased away the killing cold. Eleanor felt herself relaxing, her shivering finally stopping. "Better!" Samuel's voice was a rumble she felt as much as heard. Yes, her own voice was barely a whisper. She was acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, even through layers of clothing and blankets. This was more intimate than anything in her marriage so far, yet it felt right, natural. They lay quietly, listening to the storm rage outside. Then Samuel spoke, his voice soft in the darkness. "My sister Sarah loved storms, said they were God's way of reminding us how small we are." He paused. "She would have liked you. You're both tough as prairie grass, bending but not breaking." Eleanor turned slightly, though she couldn't see his face in the dark. "What happened to her?" "Fever took her. Same winter as my parents. I was 16. Thought I was old enough to take care of her, but..." His arm tightened unconsciously around her. "Some things you can't fight with just determination." Eleanor reached up, found his hand, squeezed it gently. "I'm sorry." "Long time ago now, but winter storms always make me remember." He was quiet for a moment. "That's why I couldn't..." When Morrison made his offer, I thought about Sarah, how she never got a chance at her own life. Her own choices seemed wrong to take yours away too. "You didn't take anything," Eleanor said fiercely. "Morrison did that. You've given me more than you know. These weeks, teaching you, learning from you. I'm not the same person who stood in that church." "Neither am I." His voice was wondering. "You gave me words. Eleanor, do you know what that means my whole life? I've had thoughts and feelings locked inside with no way to let them out proper. Now I can write them down. Read what others have written. It's like you've given me a key to the whole world." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Samuel?" "I know," he said quietly. "I know what we are and aren't. But lying here like this, warm and safe while the storm tries to tear the world apart. I need you to know that I'm grateful. For the teaching, yes, but more for treating me like a man worth teaching." Eleanor turned in his arms then, facing him in the darkness. She could barely make out his features, but she could feel his breath on her face, sense the tension in his body. "You are worth so much more than you know," she whispered. "Morrison thought he was punishing me by binding me to you. But Samuel, you're the best man I've known. Kind and patient and good in ways that matter." She felt him tremble, and not from cold. His hand came up to cup her cheek, work-roughened thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Eleanor," he breathed, and her name on his lips was prayer and plea combined. They stayed frozen that way for a long moment, balanced on the edge of something irreversible. Then, by mutual unspoken agreement, they drew back. Not apart, the cold wouldn't allow that, but enough to ease the electric tension between them. "Sleep," Samuel murmured. "Storm will break tomorrow, most like." Eleanor closed her eyes, surrounded by his warmth and the safety of his presence. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, with the storm raging outside and Samuel's steady heartbeat against her back, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death. She felt home. Morning brought quieter winds and the work of digging out. They didn't speak of the night, but something fundamental had shifted. They moved around each other with new awareness, hands brushing as they reached for the same tool, eyes meeting and holding a beat too long. The cold lingered for weeks. Each night, they shared the bed for warmth, careful to maintain the fiction that it was purely practical. But Eleanor found herself looking forward to nightfall, to those hours of closeness in the dark when they talked of everything and nothing. their voices weaving together like their gradually intertwining lives. One morning, checking the animals after a fresh snowfall, they found the old milk cow down, too weak from cold and age to rise. They tried everything warm mash, lifting her with ropes, but it was clear she was dying. Samuel knelt in the straw beside the old beast, stroking her neck as she labored to breathe. "She was a good one," he said quietly. "Gave milk right up to the end." Eleanor watched him gentle the cow through her last moments, speaking soft words of thanks for her service. When it was over, he stayed kneeling for a moment, head bowed. "Just an animal?" he said roughly, swiping at his eyes. "Foolish to mourn." "No," Eleanor said, kneeling beside him. "It's not foolish. It's human. It's good." They couldn't bury the cow in the frozen ground, but Samuel built a cairn of stones over her, marking the spot for spring. It was a small loss in the scheme of things, but it reminded them both how precarious life was on the prairie, how quickly the cold could steal what they held dear. That night, as they lay in their shared warmth, Eleanor spoke into the darkness. "I've been thinking about what you said, about choices and chances." Samuel's arm tightened around her slightly. "Oh. I think sometimes what looks like an ending is really a beginning. We just can't see it at the time. Like winter." Samuel murmured. "Looks like death, but it's just the earth resting before spring." "Yes," Eleanor breathed. "Exactly like that." Outside, the wind picked up again, but it no longer sounded threatening. It sounded like change coming, like the world reshaping itself under cover of snow. And in the darkness of their small cabin, two people who had been forced together by someone else's cruelty chose, finally, to stop fighting the warmth growing between them. Spring was still months away, but in their hearts, the thaw had already begun. The first green shoots pushed through melting snow like small miracles. Eleanor knelt in the mud, her hands deep in the soil they'd been preparing for days, feeling the earth come alive beneath her fingers. The air smelled of wet earth and possibility. "Here," Samuel said, handing her the seed packet. "Corn first, then beans to climb the stalks, squash to spread between, the three sisters, my mother called them." They worked side by side, creating neat rows in the dark soil. Eleanor's back ached and her knees were soaked through, but she felt a satisfaction she'd never known in her father's comfortable house. This food would exist because of their labor, would sustain them through their own effort. "Never thought I'd be a farmer's wife," she said, sitting back on her heels to survey their work. Samuel glanced at her, a smile playing at his lips. "Never thought I'd have a wife who could read me the farmer's almanac while we planted." The casual mention of her as his wife, real wife, not forced arrangement, made warmth bloom in Eleanor's chest. The winter had changed them. Those nights of shared warmth had become something neither could define, but both treasured. They still maintained separate spaces now that the killing cold had passed, but the distance felt temporary, a last barrier waiting to fall. That evening, as they cleaned up from the day's work, a wagon approached their cabin. Eleanor recognized Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring homestead, her 3 children clinging to the wagon sides. "Mrs. Hawkins." The woman called, and Eleanor still felt a small jolt at the name. "I heard to tell you've been teaching your husband his letters." Eleanor glanced at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. "Sean, yes, I have. My oldest, Tom, he's near 13. Sharp as a tack, but never had schooling. The school in town." Mrs. Patterson's face darkened. "They want fees we can't pay. Judge Morrison's rules." "Bring him by," Eleanor said impulsively. "Evening, after chores. I'll teach him." Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "We can pay in eggs, vegetables when they come in." "Just bring him," Eleanor interrupted gently. "Knowledge shouldn't be only for those who can afford it." After the Pattersons left, Samuel looked at Eleanor with something like awe. "You're starting a school?" Just one student. It's how everything starts. One seat, one word, one student. Within a week, Eleanor had 4 students gathering in their cabin each evening. Tom Patterson, eager and quick; Maria Santos, whose parents spoke little English but desperately wanted their daughter to read; the Clearwater twins, who walked 3 miles each way for the chance to learn. Samuel built a larger table, benches for the children. He sat with them during lessons, helping the younger ones with their letters while Eleanor worked with the older students. His patience with the children amazed her. He never forgot what it felt like to struggle with shapes that wouldn't make sense. One evening, Judge Morrison's man, Claude Hennessy, appeared at their door. He was a rat-faced creature who did Morrison's dirty work with obvious pleasure. "Heard you're running a school," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Judge says that requires permits, fees, proper certification." "It's not a school," Eleanor said calmly. "Just neighbors helping neighbors. Surely even Judge Morrison can't forbid that." Hennessy's eyes narrowed. "Judge Morrison can forbid whatever he likes. You do well to remember that. Mrs. Hawkins, your husband too, wouldn't want any accidents to befall your pretty little farm." After he left, Samuel's hands were clenched into fists. Man like that, threatening women and children. "We won't stop," Eleanor said fiercely. "These children deserve to learn." "I know." Samuel's voice was grim. "But we need to be careful. Morrison's getting desperate. The railroad's chosen a different route than he promised his investors. He needs our land more than ever." They kept teaching, but took precautions. Samuel started walking the children home after dark, carrying the old rifle just in case. Eleanor wrote to her friend in Denver, describing their informal school, creating a paper trail in case Morrison tried to move against them legally. Spring warmed into early summer. The corn reached knee-high, beans twining up the stalks like green serpents. The evening school had grown to 8 students, their voices chorusing the alphabet like a hymn in the small cabin. One particularly warm evening, after the students had gone home, Eleanor and Samuel sat on the porch he'd built, watching fireflies dance over their fields. "I've been thinking," Samuel said slowly, "about what Mrs. Santos said, about there being no real school for miles, not one that takes Mexican children or Indian children or poor children." Eleanor turned to look at him in the fading light. She could see the idea taking shape behind his eyes. "What if we built one?" he continued. "A real school, not hidden in our cabin, but standing proud, free for any child who wanted to learn. Morrison would never allow it. Morrison doesn't own the whole territory, and he's got problems of his own now." Samuel pulled out a newspaper, pointed to an article Eleanor had read to him that morning. "Federal investigators looking into land fraud. Seems we're not the only ones who've noticed his schemes." Eleanor felt hope flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. "We'd need lumber, books, slates, and I'm not a certified teacher." "You're the best teacher these children have ever had," Samuel's voice was firm. "As for the rest, I've been saving every penny from the carpentry work I do in town. The furniture I've been making, it's not much, but it's a start." Eleanor stared at him. "You've been planning this?" He ducked his head, suddenly shy. "Maybe. Seemed like something worth working toward. You light up when you're teaching, Eleanor, like you're exactly where you're meant to be. We'd be taking on Morrison directly. He could make our lives very difficult." "Our lives started difficult," Samuel reminded her. "But look at us now. We've got crops in the ground, children learning at our table, neighbors who stand by us. That's not nothing." Eleanor reached over, took his hand. It was the first time she'd initiated such contact in daylight, outside the necessity of winter nights. Samuel's breath caught, his fingers intertwining with hers. "All right," she said. "Let's build a school." They started small. Samuel actually wrote, his handwriting clear and strong to lumber mills for prices. Eleanor corresponded with teachers' colleges about certification requirements. The children in their evening class helped clear a piece of land behind the cabin, pulling weeds and moving stones with the promise that it would someday be their real schoolyard. Not everyone supported their plan. Some townsfolk, those who benefited from Morrison's system, muttered about troublemakers and people not knowing their place. But others, the struggling farmers, the immigrant families, the ones who'd been shut out of Morrison's version of prosperity, they offered what help they could. A load of lumber here, a box of old books there. Hands willing to work when work was needed. One night, as Eleanor prepared lessons at their table, Samuel approached with something wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a wooden sign, beautifully carved "Prairie School, all children welcome." The letters were perfect, each one showing the hours Samuel had spent practicing, learning, mastering the shapes that had once been foreign to him. "Oh, Samuel," Eleanor breathed, "it's perfect." "Figured every school needs a sign," he said gruffly. "Might as well make it clear from the start what kind of school it'll be." Eleanor stood, reaching up to frame his face with her hands. "You wonderful man," she whispered. "How did I get so lucky?" "Funny," Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I was thinking the same thing." They stood there in the lamplight, poised on the edge of something. Then Eleanor rose on her toes and kissed him. Not the brief, obligatory kiss of their wedding day, but a real kiss, full of promise and choice and all the feelings that had grown between them like their carefully tended crops. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. "Eleanor," Samuel started, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "I know," she said. "I know what we started as. But Samuel, that's not what we are now. Is it?" "No," he agreed, pulling her close. "No, it's not." That night, for the first time, they went to bed together, not from necessity, but from desire. As Eleanor lay in Samuel's arms, listening to his heartbeat, she thought about the strange paths life took. What had begun as punishment had become blessing. What had seemed like an ending had become a beginning. Outside, a screech owl called across the prairie, and the wind rustled through their young corn. Inside, two people who had found each other through someone else's cruelty chose to write their own story instead. And in the morning, they would continue building their farm, their school, their life together. One word, one seed, one choice at a time. The courthouse stood like a monument to Morrison's power, its brick facade baking in the summer heat. Dust devils swirled in the street as townsfolk gathered, drawn by word that something unprecedented was about to happen. Eleanor smoothed her dress, her good one, saved for Sundays, and glanced at Samuel beside her. He stood tall in his best clothes, the ones they'd bought with egg money so he'd look respectable for this day. In his hands, he held a leather folder containing their petition, the land documents, and most importantly, the signatures of 43 families supporting their school. "Ready?" Eleanor asked quietly. Samuel met her eyes. "I can read every word in these papers, thanks to you. Yes, I'm ready." They entered the courtroom to find it already packed. Judge Morrison sat behind his high bench like a spider in its web, his cold eyes tracking their movement. The smell of sweat and tobacco smoke hung heavy in the air. "The matter of the proposed school on the Hawkins property," the clerk announced in a bored tone. Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Hawkins, I understand you wish to address the court regarding land use permits." "I do, Your Honor." Samuel's voice was steady, carrying across the room. Whispers rustled through the crowd. The servant who couldn't read 6 months ago was about to speak in legal proceedings. Samuel opened his folder, drew out the first document. According to the Homestead Act of 1862, Section 4, Paragraph 2, he began to read, his voice growing stronger with each word. The legal language that would have been incomprehensible to him before now flowed from his lips with understanding and purpose. Eleanor watched Morrison's face change as Samuel systematically dismantled each potential objection. The judge had expected stammering, confusion, perhaps the need to have someone else speak for him. Instead, he got a man who had spent months not just learning to read, but studying every law and statute that might apply to their situation. Furthermore, Samuel continued, the Territorial Education Statute of 1867 specifically encourages the establishment of schools in rural areas, with tax exemptions for any property used primarily for educational purposes. You seem remarkably well versed in the law for a stable hand, Morrison said, acid in his tone. I'm a landowner now. Your Honor seemed prudent to understand my rights. Samuel glanced at Eleanor, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. My wife taught me that knowledge is power. Figured I'd better get some. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd, quickly suppressed. Eleanor stood then, her own folder in hand. If I may address the court. Morrison's jaw tightened. This is highly irregular. No more irregular than forcing a woman to marry against her will to settle her father's debts, Eleanor said clearly. But that's water under the bridge. What matters now is the future specifically, the future of the 43 children whose parents have signed this petition. She began reading the names, each one a family shut out of Morrison's fee-based town school. Mexican families, Irish immigrants, freed slaves making their way west, poor white farmers barely scraping by. As she read, those families stood in the courtroom, one by one, silent testimony to the need. This is about more than permits. Eleanor continued. It's about whether Prosperity Creek will be a town where only the wealthy can afford to have their children learn, or whether we believe that every child deserves the chance to read, write, and cipher. Pretty words, Morrison sneered. But the law. The law, Samuel interrupted, pulling out another document, is quite clear. I have here a letter from the territorial governor himself, expressing support for our school and confirming that no local official has the authority to prevent its establishment on private property. The courtroom erupted. Morrison's face went from red to purple. How dare you go over my head? How dare you try to keep children from learning? Eleanor shot back. How dare you use your position to line your pockets while families struggle? How dare you? Enough, Morrison slammed his gavel. I'll need time to review these documents. Court is adjourned until... Actually, a new voice spoke from the back of the room. I don't think that will be necessary. Everyone turned. A man in a federal marshal's badge stood in the doorway, 2 deputies flanking him. Judge Elias Morrison, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, extortion, and corruption of public office. The courtroom exploded into chaos. Morrison tried to flee through his chambers but was caught by the deputies. As they let him out in shackles, he shot a venomous look at Eleanor and Samuel. This isn't over, he snarled. Yes, Samuel said quietly. It is. In the aftermath, as people milled about discussing the shocking turn of events, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the families who'd stood with them. Mrs. Santos gripped her hands, tears streaming down her face. My Maria, she will go to real school. She will have chances I never did. Tom Patterson pumped Samuel's hand enthusiastically. You did it, Mr. Hawkins. You beat him at his own game. We did it, Samuel corrected, pulling Eleanor close. All of us together. Later, as they rode home in their wagon, Eleanor leaned against Samuel's shoulder. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and their corn stood tall in the fields. When did you write to the governor? She asked. Remember when I went to town for supplies last month, took a detour to the territorial capital. Figured if Morrison wanted to play legal games, we'd better learn the rules. He glanced down at her. Turns out, when you can read and write, all sorts of doors open. You can write to governors, federal marshals, even newspapers interested in stories about corrupt judges. Eleanor laughed. the sound bright as birdsong. "You've become quite the strategist, Mr. Hawkins." "Had a good teacher." He reined in the horses as they reached their property, looking at the cleared space where the school would stand. "Think we can have it built before harvest. With all the help we've been promised, I think we can do anything." That evening, their cabin overflowed with neighbors come to celebrate. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar. Music spilled out into the prairie night as people danced in the yard, children racing between the adults' legs, laughter replacing the fear that had gripped the community for so long. Eleanor stood in the doorway, watching Samuel dance with a little Maria Santos standing on his boots, the child giggling as he spun her around. 6 months ago. She would never have imagined this scene their home, a center of joy and community. Her husband beloved by children who saw him not as a servant but as the man who'd helped give them a future. "Mrs. Hawkins." Tom Patterson appeared at her elbow. "Ma wanted me to give you this." He handed her an envelope. Inside was $1, probably all the Pattersons could spare, and a note in Mrs. Patterson's careful hand. "For books for the school. With gratitude." Eleanor's eyes misted. By the end of the evening, she had a dozen such envelopes. Poor families giving what they could to make the school a reality. It was more moving than any large donation could have been. As the last wagon rolled away and quiet settled over their land, Eleanor and Samuel sat on their porch, exhausted but exhilarated. "We've started something," Samuel said wonderingly. "Something that'll outlast us." "The best things usually do." Eleanor laced her fingers through his. "Samuel, do you remember what they whispered at our wedding? Forced to marry a servant as punishment. What followed changed everything." "Hard to forget." "They were right, you know, about everything changing. Just not in the way they thought." She turned to face him in the moonlight. "I was so angry that day. So ashamed. And now I can't imagine any other life, any other husband." Samuel cupped her face gently. "Morrison thought he was punishing you. Instead, he gave us each other, gave this community a chance to come together. Sometimes I think we should thank him." Eleanor laughed. "Let's not go that far." "But Samuel, I love you. Not because I have to, not because we're married, but because of who you are. The man who speaks up for those who can't, who builds tables for children to learn at, who reads to me by firelight and makes me feel like I'm home." "Eleanor," Samuel's voice was rough with emotion, "I loved you from the moment you offered to teach me. Not for your beauty, though Lord knows you're beautiful, but for seeing me as more than what I was. For believing I could be better." They kissed there in the moonlight, surrounded by their growing crops and the promise of the school to come. When they finally went inside, the cabin felt too small to contain their happiness. "Next year," Samuel said as they prepared for bed, "we'll add on to the house, make room for, well, for whatever comes next." Eleanor smiled, pressing a hand to her still flat stomach. She hadn't told him yet about the suspicions that had been growing alongside their corn. There would be time for that tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after. Tonight was for celebrating victories won and challenges overcome. Tonight was for remembering that sometimes the harshest punishments could become the greatest blessings, if you had the courage to transform them. Outside, the wind whispered through the corn, and the stars wheeled overhead. And two people who had begun as strangers forced together lay entwined, partners in every sense of the word. The school would be built, children would learn, and love would continue to grow in the good soil of the prairie, tended by two people who understood that the most important things in life, knowledge, justice, love itself, could never be forced, only chosen, again and again. With each new day, the corn stood tall as a man on horseback when the first wisps of smoke appeared on the horizon. Eleanor was hanging laundry, her movement slow with the weight of her pregnancy now showing, when she noticed the darkening sky. "Samuel," she called. shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. He emerged from the half-built schoolhouse, hammer still in hand, sawdust in his hair, following her gaze. His face went grim. Prairie fire, moving fast with this wind. Within minutes, the smoke had thickened to a wall of gray-black. The smell of burning grass sharp in the air. Birds fled overhead in panicked clouds, and the horses in the corral whinnied nervously. "Ring the bell," Samuel shouted, already running for the fire break they'd plowed in spring. Eleanor rushed to the dinner bell, clanging it in the pattern everyone knew meant danger. 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick. Neighbors appeared as if from nowhere. Tom Patterson on his father's horse, the Santos family in their wagon, others running on foot, without words. They formed a line, passing buckets from the creek, wetting down the ground around the cabins and the precious, almost finished school. The fire came like a living thing, a wall of orange and red eating everything in its path. The heat hit them like a physical blow, and Eleanor had to force herself not to step back. "Stay together," Samuel commanded, his voice carrying over the roar. "Keep the water coming." They fought with bucket and shovel, beating at spot fires that jumped the break, faces blackened with soot and sweat. Eleanor's dress caught a spark, and Maria Santos's quick hands beat it out before it could catch. Through the smoke, Eleanor saw a figure stumble old Mr. Clearwater, overcome by the heat. Without thinking, she dropped her bucket and ran to him, pulling him away from the fire line. Her pregnant body protested, but she didn't stop until they were safe. "Mrs. Hawkins," he wheezed. "You shouldn't." "Hush," she said, helping him to the water barrel. "We don't leave anyone behind." The battle seemed endless. Just when they thought they had it contained, the wind would shift, sending new fingers of flame toward their buildings. Samuel's shirt caught fire as he beat at a burning patch too close to the schoolhouse. He rolled in the dirt, Eleanor's heart stopping until she saw him rise again, singed but whole. Then, like a miracle, the wind died. Without that driving force, the fire slowed, became manageable. They fought on as darkness fell until finally, impossibly, only smoking earth remained. People collapsed where they stood, exhausted, coughing, but alive. In the flickering light of the remaining spot fires, Eleanor counted faces everyone accounted for, though some bore burns and all were black with soot. "The school?" someone asked. Samuel walked to the building, running his hands along the walls. "Scorched on one side, but standing, she'll make it." A ragged cheer went up. They'd saved what mattered most. As people began to drift away to check their own properties, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure standing at the edge of the light. Judge Morrison, no longer judge. She reminded herself looked older, smaller somehow. His fancy clothes were gone, replaced by common work clothes, and his face bore none of its old arrogance. "Elias," Samuel said, noticing him too. His voice was neutral, careful. I came to help," Morrison said, and Eleanor realized with shock that he was one of the soot-covered figures who'd fought beside them. Saw the smoke from town. They stood in awkward silence. Then Morrison cleared his throat. "I wanted to... That is, I've had time to think. In jail, about what I did. To you. To everyone." He met Eleanor's eyes. "I'm sorry. It's not enough. I know, but I'm sorry." Eleanor felt Samuel tense beside her, ready to send the man away. But something in Morrison's broken expression stopped her. "Why?" she asked simply. Morrison laughed bitterly. "Because I've lost everything. Power, money, respect. And watching you tonight, all of you, fighting together for something that matters, I realized I never had anything real at all." He looked at the scorched schoolhouse. "You built something I tried to prevent. A community, a future, while I built nothing but fear." "Pretty words," Samuel said, echoing Morrison's own dismissal from the courthouse. "Yes," Morrison agreed. "But I mean them. I'm leaving town tomorrow, starting over somewhere else, trying to be better, but I wanted you to know what you did mattered. You showed this whole town a different way." He turned to go, then paused. "Take care of each other." They watched him disappear into the darkness. Eleanor slipped her hand into Samuel's. "Do you believe him?" "Doesn't matter," Samuel said after a moment. "What matters is we're still here, still building." In the days that followed, the community came together in new ways. Those whose farms had suffered less shared with those who'd lost crops. Everyone contributed to fixing the school's fire damage. Even some townspeople who'd previously kept their distance appeared with donations of books or supplies. Eleanor, despite Samuel's protests about her condition, insisted on helping with the lighter work. She organized the donated books, painted signs for the classroom, and taught impromptu lessons to children eager to see inside their almost ready school. One evening, as she and Samuel worked side by side painting the repaired wall, he suddenly set down his brush. "Eleanor, about Morrison's apology." "Yes?" "It made me think about forgiveness, about moving forward." He took her paint-stained hands in his. "I've been writing to my cousins back in Missouri. Told them about you, about the school. They want to come west, bring their families, start fresh." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Samuel, that's wonderful. But where would they live?" "That's what I wanted to talk about. What if we didn't just build a school? What if we built a real community? Set aside plots for families who want to settle. Help each other get started." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "From punishment to prosperity. Oh, Samuel, yes, yes." He grinned, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Thought you might say that. Already talked to the land office. The plots around us are still available. And with Morrison gone, prices are fair again." They worked late into the night, planning and dreaming. By the time they walked back to their cabin, the first stars were appearing. "Look," Eleanor said, pointing to the schoolhouse silhouetted against the sky. "Our first building still stands, even after the fire. That has to mean something." "Means we build things to last," Samuel said, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "Schools and families and communities." The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Thomas Whitfield stood at their door, hat in hand, looking every one of his years. "Papa?" Eleanor breathed. "Eleanor, Samuel." He nodded to each. "May I come in?" They sat awkwardly around the table where so many children had learned their letters. Thomas cleared his throat repeatedly before speaking. "I heard about the fire, about how you all fought together, about the school." He met Eleanor's eyes. "Your mother would be so proud. I haven't been the father you deserved." "Papa." "Let me finish. I've sold the bank, paid what debts I could. I'm not rich anymore, but I'm not beholden to anyone either." He pulled out an envelope, set it on the table. "This is for your school. It's not much, but it's honestly earned." Eleanor opened the envelope, gasped at the amount. "Papa, this is too much." "It's not enough. Not for what I put you through." He looked at Samuel. "You've been more of a man than I ever was. You protected her, provided for her, gave her the life I failed to." He stood. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I see now what real worth is." After he left, Eleanor and Samuel sat in stunned silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. "Day full of surprises." Eleanor laughed, wiping at tears. "Who would have thought Morrison apologizing? Papa seeing clearly." She looked at the money. "This will buy so many books. Samuel, supplies for years." From punishment to possibility. Samuel said softly, "Your father's failed gamble led to our success. Morrison's cruelty created our community. Strange how life works." That night, as they lay together, Eleanor felt the baby move for the first time. she gasped, grabbed Samuel's hand, placed it on her belly. "There," she whispered. "Feel that?" Samuel's face filled with wonder. "Our child, moving in there like it's dancing. Maybe it hears the music." Eleanor said, "All the life we're building here." They lay quietly, Samuel's hand spread protectively over her stomach, feeling the small movements of new life. Outside, coyotes called in the distance, and wind rustled through their corn, shorter now where the fire had caught it, but still growing. "I've been thinking about names," Eleanor said. "If it's a girl, Hope, because that's what we're planting here. What we're teaching. Hope Hawkins." Samuel tried out the name. "I like it. And if it's a boy?" Eleanor smiled in the darkness. "Chance, because sometimes what seems like misfortune is really just opportunity in disguise." "Hope or Chance Hawkins?" Samuel pulled her closer. "First student in the new school." "The first of many." Eleanor agreed. "Oh, Samuel, when I think of where we started." "Don't," he said gently. "That was who we were forced to be. All of this is who we chose to become." The school would open next month. Families were already inquiring about the land Samuel had mentioned. Their child would be born in a community that hadn't existed a year ago, surrounded by neighbors who'd fought fire together and would face whatever else came the same way. From forced marriage to chosen family, from punishment to purpose, from isolation to community. The transformation was complete, and yet Eleanor knew it was also just beginning. Every child who learned to read, every family who settled nearby, every seed planted in the good prairie soil would continue the story they'd started. Tomorrow there would be more work, always more work. But tonight, with Samuel's arms around her and their child dancing beneath her heart, Eleanor felt the deep satisfaction of lives well lived and choices well made. The fire had tested them, and they'd survived. Together. Always together. They would build something even fire couldn't destroy, a future written in hope and possibility. One word, one child, one chance at a time. The blizzard struck without warning, transforming the prairie into a howling white void. Eleanor woke to find the windows completely covered with snow, the cabin dark despite it being past dawn. The temperature had plummeted so drastically that ice formed on the inside walls. "Samuel?" She reached across the bed, finding his space empty and cold. "Here." His voice came from near the fireplace. "Been up since midnight keeping the fire going. We're snowed in proper." Eleanor rose carefully, her pregnancy making movement awkward, and wrapped herself in every blanket she could find. Even so, the cold bit through to her bones. Samuel had stuffed rags in every crack, but the wind still found ways inside, bringing snow that didn't melt even near the fire. "The animals," she said, sudden fear gripping her. "Fed and watered them at first light, before it got too bad to see. They're in the lean-to, huddled together, but Eleanor," his face was grave. "This is a bad one, maybe the worst I've seen." They spent the morning trying to maintain warmth, burning through their wood supply at an alarming rate. By noon, Samuel made the decision to venture out for more from the woodpile. He tied a rope around his waist, the other end secured to the door handle. "If I'm not back in 10 minutes, don't come looking," he said firmly. "Promise me." Eleanor gripped his hands. "Be careful." He disappeared into the white wall outside. Eleanor counted heartbeats, trying not to panic when the rope went taut and stayed that way. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Samuel stumbled back inside, ice coating his eyebrows and beard, dragging an armload of wood. "Can't see 2 feet," he gasped, shivering violently. "Temperatures dropping fast." They built up the fire, but Eleanor could tell it wasn't enough. The cold was winning, creeping in from all sides. Then she started coughing deep, rattling coughs that left her breathless. "Just the cold air," she said, seeing Samuel's worried face. But by evening, She was burning with fever even as she shivered with cold. The cough worsened, and she could barely catch her breath between spasms. Samuel's attempts to hide his fear only made her more frightened. "The baby," she whispered between coughs. "If something happens—" "Nothing's going to happen," Samuel said fiercely. "I won't let it." He bundled her in every blanket they owned, spooned warm broth between her lips when she could manage it. But the fever climbed higher, and her coughs grew weaker, more labored. In her delirium, Eleanor drifted between past and present. She was standing in her father's bank again, Morrison sneering at her, then at their wedding, seeing Samuel's kind eyes for the first time, teaching him letters while summer sun streamed through windows, building dreams in schools and a life together. "Stay with me." Samuel's voice anchored her to the present. "Eleanor, please, stay with me." Through the haze, she heard him doing something unexpected. He was reading, his voice, strong and sure now, read from their Bible, from the primers they used for teaching, from the notebook where she'd written their plans for the school. "Listen," he said desperately. "Remember when you taught me this? Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. You said it was your mother's favorite. Keep listening. Eleanor, keep breathing." His voice went on through the terrible night, reading everything they had, even the labels on tins when he ran out of books. He read her the future they'd planned, the names of students who would fill their school, the dreams they'd whispered in the dark. Sometime near dawn, Eleanor's fever broke. She opened her eyes to find Samuel still reading, his voice hoarse, tears frozen on his cheeks. "Samuel," she whispered. He dropped the book, gathered her carefully in his arms. "Thank God, thank God." "You saved me," she said wonderingly. "With words, with all the words I taught you." "You saved me first," he said roughly. "Every day since you agreed to teach me, don't ever scare me like that again." The blizzard raged for 3 more days. They rationed food, melted snow for water, and kept each other warm. Samuel read to her constantly to keep her spirits up, he said, but Eleanor knew it was also to reassure himself she was still there, still breathing. On the 4th day, they woke to silence. Glorious, complete silence. Samuel dug them out to find a world transformed. Snowdrifts reached the roof in places, and the landscape was unrecognizable. "The school," Eleanor said anxiously. They trudged through hip-deep snow to check. The building stood, though snow had blown through gaps in the walls they hadn't noticed before, but it had survived. One by one, neighbors began emerging, checking on each other. The Pattersons had lost 2 chickens to the cold. The Santos family's well had frozen solid, but miraculously, no human lives were lost. "Though we came close," Samuel told Tom Patterson quietly, glancing at Eleanor. Word of her illness spread, and help poured in despite everyone's own struggles. Mrs. Santos brought a tea her grandmother swore by for lung ailments. Mrs. Patterson contributed eggs for strength. Even families they barely knew appeared with offerings: a jar of preserves, a knitted shawl, a promise of help come spring. "Look what you've built," Samuel told Eleanor as they watched neighbors help each other dig out. "This community exists because of your teaching, your kindness." "Our teaching, our kindness," Eleanor corrected, then was seized by another coughing fit. The cough lingered for weeks, leaving her weak and frustrated. The baby seemed fine, still moving regularly, but Eleanor tired easily. She had to watch from the window as others finished the school building, each hammer blow a reminder of her helplessness. One afternoon, as she dozed by the fire, she woke to find a familiar figure sitting across from her. Judge Morrison Elias now. She supposed he looked even more changed. His hands bore calluses, his face was windburned, and his clothes were patched but clean. "Samuel let me in," he said quietly. "I heard you were ill." Eleanor straightened, wary. "Why are you here?" "To repay a debt." He pulled out a worn leather journal. I've been working at the territorial capital, copying documents, filing papers. Honest work. But I remembered something from my previous life, something that might help you. He opened the journal, showing her pages of neat handwriting. Before the railroad changed routes, there were surveys done, plans for a permanent school, funded by the territory. The paperwork was buried when the route changed, but the authorization still stands. Eleanor leaned forward, reading rapidly despite her weakness. This says any community that can demonstrate need and capability can apply for funding, books, supplies, even a teacher's salary. I've already filed the initial paperwork. Morrison said, listed you as the teacher. The school has established and serving 43 students. It should be approved within the month. Eleanor stared at him. Why? Morrison stood, his movement stiff. Because I destroyed enough in my life. Maybe it's time I helped build something. He paused at the door. Tell Samuel I'm grateful he let me in. Not many men would have. After he left, Eleanor sat holding the journal, tears streaming down her face. When Samuel came in from chores, she showed him everything. Territorial funding, he said slowly. Real books, proper supplies, a salary for you. For us, Eleanor corrected. You teach too. The little ones adore you. That night, as they lay together listening to wind howl outside, gentler now. Without the killing cold, Eleanor felt the baby kick strongly. Active tonight, Samuel observed, his hand on her belly. Happy, I think, knowing the world it's coming into. Eleanor turned to face him. Samuel, if I had died in the storm. But you didn't. But if I had, promise me you'd keep the school going. Keep teaching. It matters more than just us now. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. I promise, but Eleanor, you're going to be here. You're going to see our children, all of them. The one coming and the ones in that schoolhouse grow up educated and free. We're going to grow old together. Arguing about the best way to teach arithmetic and watching sunsets from that porch I still need to expand. Eleanor laughed softly. Such plans you have, Mr. Hawkins. Such plans we have, Mrs. Hawkins, he corrected. Starting with getting you well. That baby needs its mother, and those children need their teacher. And his voice roughened. I need my wife. The woman who saw more in me than I saw in myself, who gave me words when I had none. You always had words, Eleanor said. They were just waiting to be set free. Outside, snow began falling again, but gently this time. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way held tight to what they'd built, not just a building or a school, but a life rich with purpose and possibility. The winter would end, as winters always did. Spring would come with its new life and new chances, and in a small schoolhouse on the prairie, children would learn to read and write and dream, taught by two people who understood that education was more than letters on a page. It was hope itself, passed from one heart to another, strong enough to survive any storm. Spring arrived like a blessing, melting snow into rushing streams and revealing the green shoots that had waited patiently beneath white blankets. Eleanor stood before the completed schoolhouse, one hand on her swollen belly, the other holding the official letter from the territorial government. Approved, she said for the third time, as if repetition might make it more real. Full funding for books, supplies, and 2 teacher salaries. Samuel finished hanging the wooden sign he'd carved months ago. Prairie School, all children welcome, and climbed down from the ladder. Look at that, proper as any school back east. The building gleamed with fresh whitewash, windows sparkling in the morning sun. Inside, neat rows of desks, salvaged and repaired from various sources, waited for students. The smell of new lumber mixed with chalk dust and possibility. Tomorrow, Eleanor breathed. Our first official day. That evening, families arrived for the opening ceremony. Wagons crowded the yard. Children racing around in their best clothes. Parents carrying covered dishes for the celebration. Eleanor wore her mother's blue dress, let out to accommodate her pregnancy, and Samuel stood beside her in his wedding suit, now properly fitted. Reverend Thompson offered a blessing, his words carrying across the gathered crowd. "Lord, let this be a place where knowledge flows like water, where every child finds their voice, where the future is written one lesson at a time." Then Eleanor rang the school bell, a donation from the disbanded Morrison Bank, and declared the Prairie School officially open. "This school," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "exists because a community chose hope over fear, education over ignorance. It stands because neighbors fought fire together, survived storms together, and refused to let anyone tell them their children didn't deserve to learn." She paused, finding Samuel's eyes in the crowd. "It exists because sometimes what begins as hardship becomes blessing, because a man who couldn't read chose to learn, and in learning, taught us all what's possible." Samuel stepped forward, holding a Bible, the same one he'd learned to read from, in his clear, strong voice. He read, and the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom. He looked up at the assembled families. "That's what we want for every child who walks through these doors. Strength, spirit, wisdom, no matter where they come from or what their parents do for work." Maria Santos, now 8 and bright as a new penny, presented Eleanor with a bouquet of prairie wildflowers. "Gracias, Senora Hawkins, for teaching us we matter." Eleanor had to blink back tears as child after child came forward. Tom Patterson with a carved pencil holder, the Clearwater twins with a drawing of the school, little James O'Brien with a handful of precious store-bought chalk. The celebration lasted until stars appeared. Families shared food and stories. Children played games in the schoolyard. And old Elias Morrison, who had quietly returned to help with the building, sat on the steps teaching a group of boys to whittle. Strange sight. Samuel murmured to Eleanor, "The man who tried to stop this helping make it happen." "People can change," Eleanor said softly. "We're proof of that." As the evening wound down, Thomas Whitfield approached. Eleanor's father looked healthier than he had in years, the weight of debt and shame lifted from his shoulders. "Eleanor," he said formally. Then his composure cracked. "Ellie, I'm so proud. Your mother would be. She would be so proud." He pressed an envelope into her hands. "I've been working as a bookkeeper in Denver. Honest work, honest wages. This is for the school library." Eleanor hugged him, feeling him stiffen in surprise before returning the embrace. "Thank you, Papa." "No," he said gruffly. "Thank you for showing me what really matters." The next morning, Eleanor woke before dawn, too excited to sleep. She dressed carefully, hands trembling slightly, and walked with Samuel to the school. The morning sun painted everything gold, and birds sang from the cottonwoods. "Ready?" Samuel asked, squeezing her hand. "I've been ready my whole life," Eleanor replied. The children arrived in waves, some walking, some riding. The lucky few in wagons, 43 students in all, ranging from 5 to 15, speaking English and Spanish and German and languages Eleanor was still learning to recognize. She rang the bell, and they filed in with a mix of excitement and nervousness. Some had never been in a real school before. Others had been turned away from the town school for lacking funds or the right background. "Welcome," Eleanor said, standing at the front of the room. "In this school, we have only one rule that matters: everyone learns, everyone teaches, everyone belongs." She divided them by ability rather than age, Samuel taking the beginning readers while she worked with the more advanced students. The system they developed through months of kitchen table teaching scaled beautifully to the full classroom. Young Tom Patterson helped the newest readers, patient with their struggles because he remembered his own. Maria Santos translated for the Spanish-speaking children, building bridges with words. Even the youngest students had something to offer. Little Sarah McKenna knew all her letters and delighted in teaching them to others. At lunch, eaten outside in the spring sunshine, Eleanor watched Samuel surrounded by children, using sticks and stones to teach counting. His large hands, once considered fit only for rough work, now guided small fingers in forming letters, gentle and sure. Mrs. Hawkins. A small voice interrupted her thoughts. Timothy Chen, whose family had recently arrived from California, stood before her. My papa says Chinese children don't go to school with white children, but you said everyone belongs. Eleanor knelt carefully, her pregnancy making the movement awkward. Your papa is right that many places have those rules, but not here. Here, we judge by what's in here. She tapped his head, and here, she placed the hand over his heart. Not by where your family comes from or what you look like. The boy's face lit up. So I can really learn to read. You can learn anything you're willing to work for, Eleanor assured him. The afternoon brought unexpected challenges. Some of the older boys, used to working full-time, struggled to sit still. 2 children spoke no English at all. The range of abilities was staggering. Some students were ready for advanced arithmetic, while others couldn't write their names. But Eleanor and Samuel adapted. As they'd learned to adapt to everything life threw at them, they created groups, assigned peer teachers, modified lessons on the fly. When frustration mounted, Samuel told stories of his own struggles learning letters at 30 years old. When energy flagged, Eleanor led them in songs that incorporated lessons. By the day's end, every child had learned something new. More importantly, every child had taught something to a word in another language, a different way to remember multiplication, a song from their homeland. As the last wagon rolled away, Eleanor sank onto the steps, exhausted but exhilarated. Samuel sat beside her, equally tired. We did it, she said wonderingly. A real school day. First of many. Samuel agreed. Though I think we'll need help soon. 43 is a lot for 2 teachers, especially with... He gestured to her belly. Eleanor laughed. Already planning ahead? Always. He grew serious. Eleanor, watching you today. You were born for this. The way you see each child. Make them feel valuable. It's a gift. We both have that gift, Eleanor said. You taught Timothy his numbers by relating them to railroad ties. He'd been counting them on the journey here. I would never have thought of that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their fields. The corn was already knee-high, growing strong in soil enriched by last year's fire ash. In a few weeks, their child would be born into a world so different from the one they'd inhabited just a year ago. Do you ever think about it? Eleanor asked suddenly. What would have happened if Morrison hadn't forced us together? Samuel considered. You'd have married someone proper. I'd have kept working other men's land. The school wouldn't exist. These children wouldn't be learning. He turned to her. Seems like Morrison did us all a favor, in his twisted way. Eleanor laughed, then winced as the baby kicked hard. Active tonight. Eager to join the school, maybe, Samuel said, placing his hand where the baby moved. Future student right here. The first of many, I hope, Eleanor said softly. Many students. Many children. She met his eyes. This one needs brothers and sisters. The school needs to grow. The community needs more families like ours built on choice, not chance. Samuel kissed her gently. I love you, Eleanor Hawkins. Love the life we've built, the future we're creating. I love you too, she whispered. My husband, my partner, my dearest friend. A wolf howled in the distance, and the first stars appeared. Inside the schoolhouse, books waited on shelves. Slates stood ready for tomorrow's lessons, and hope itself seemed to live in the very walls. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, children who struggled, parents who doubted. The eternal battle for resources and recognition. But tonight, Eleanor and Samuel Hawkins sat on the steps of their dream made real, proof that sometimes the worst punishments could become the greatest gifts. "We should go in," Eleanor said eventually. "Early morning tomorrow." "Every morning," Samuel agreed, helping her to her feet. "For as long as we're able." They walked home hand in hand, leaving the schoolhouse behind but carrying its promise with them. In the cabin that had once seemed like a prison, they prepared for bed, talking over the day's successes and planning tomorrow's lessons. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through new corn, and the school bell swayed gently in its tower, ready to ring out hope across the plains come morning. The sunset painted the prairie in shades of crimson and gold, the same colors that had welcomed Eleanor to this land over a year ago. But now, instead of seeing desolation, she saw home. The wind carried the laughter of children from the schoolyard, where an end-of-term celebration was in full swing. "Mrs. Hawkins, Mrs. Hawkins!" Maria Santos ran up, her face bright with excitement. "Look what I can read." She held up a book, not a primer, but a real novel. Every word. Eleanor smiled, shifting baby Hope on her hip. Her daughter, 3 months old now, gurgled happily at the excitement around her. "Show me, Maria." The girl read fluently, her voice confident and clear. Around them, similar scenes played out: children who'd arrived unable to write their names now reading stories, solving arithmetic, writing letters to family back east. Samuel approached, Tom Patterson at his side. The boy had grown inches over the year and now served as an assistant teacher for the younger students. "Mr. Hawkins has been showing me the plans," Tom said eagerly, "for the library edition." "If the harvest is good," Samuel cautioned, but his eyes sparkled with the same excitement. "We'll see." The schoolyard overflowed with families. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food: German sausages next to Mexican tamales, Irish soda bread beside Chinese dumplings. The Prairie School had become more than an educational institution. It was the heart of a community that hadn't existed 2 years ago. "Hard to believe," said a familiar voice. Eleanor turned to find Elias Morrison. She still had to remind herself to think of him as Elias, not Judge, standing uncertainly at the edge of the gathering. "That you're always welcome here?" Eleanor asked gently. "You helped build this place, Elias. In the end, you chose to help rather than hinder." The older man's eyes misted. "I spent so many years building walls, it feels strange to be inside them, welcomed." "Redemption is always possible," Samuel said, joining them. "You taught us that, in a roundabout way." As evening drew on, families began sharing stories. Mrs. Patterson told how her Tom was now teaching his younger siblings. Mr. Santos spoke proudly of Maria writing letters for their whole neighborhood. The Chen family demonstrated how Timothy had become the translator for new Chinese arrivals, bridging languages with the confidence education brings. Then old Mr. Clearwater stood, clearing his throat. "I have something to say. When this school opened, I thought it was foolishness. Mixing all kinds of children, taught by a woman and a man who just learned his letters." He paused, looking at Eleanor and Samuel. "I was wrong. My grandson reads better than I ever could. He knows numbers, history, things I never dreamed of. You didn't just teach our children, you changed our futures." One by one, others stood to speak. Parents who'd been suspicious now sang praises. Children who'd felt worthless now stood tall. The community that had grown around the school was living proof that education could transform more than individual lives. It could reshape entire societies. As the celebration wound down, Eleanor found herself standing where she'd stood a year ago, looking at the sign Samuel had carved, but now it hung on a building that bustled with life, surrounded by homes of families who'd moved here specifically for the school. "Regrets?" Samuel asked, joining her, Hope sleeping in his arms. "How could I regret this?" Eleanor gestured to the scene before them. children learning, families thriving, a community built on hope rather than fear. I meant about the comfortable life you could have had, the easy path. Eleanor laughed. The easy path would have led nowhere worth going. She leaned against his shoulder. Do you know what Maria asked me today? If she could become a teacher too. A Mexican girl who wouldn't have been allowed in Morrison's town school dreams of teaching others. What did you tell her? That she could become anything she's willing to work for. That here, on this prairie, we write our own futures. They walked slowly toward the school building. Other families drifting away with waves and promises to see each other tomorrow. Inside the single classroom that they hoped to soon expand, Eleanor lit a lamp and looked around at the evidence of learning maps on the walls. Student work displayed proudly. Shelves of books that grew fuller each month. Remember when you could barely hold chalk? She asked Samuel, watching him write tomorrow's lessons on the board in his now confident hand. Remember when you couldn't haul water without spilling half? He countered with a grin. We've both learned so much. Eleanor settled into her teaching chair, hope still peaceful in her father's arms. Not just skills, but how to see people, how to build instead of tear down, how to choose love over fear. Samuel set down the chalk, came to kneel beside her chair. Eleanor, there's something I've been wanting to say. That first night, when I promised not to force anything on you. Samuel! Let me finish. I made that promise because I knew what it was like to be powerless. But somewhere along the way, you gave me power over words, over my own life, over the future. And in return, he took her hand. In return, you chose me. Not because Morrison forced it, but because you wanted to. That choice means more to me than all the land in Colorado. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks. You gave me the same gift, the choice to be who I truly am, not who society expected, a teacher, a mother, a partner in every sense. Baby Hope stirred, making soft sounds, and they both laughed. Speaking of partnerships, Samuel said, I had a letter from my cousins. They'll be here by harvest. 3 families, 8 children for the school. We'll need that addition sooner than planned. We'll need more teachers, too. I was thinking, what if we wrote to that teachers' college in Denver, told them about our school, invited new graduates who might want to make a real difference? Eleanor's eyes lit up. Yes, and we could offer housing, build small cabins for teachers, create a real educational community. They talked long into the evening, plans spinning out like spider silk, delicate but strong. By the time they walked home beneath a star-filled sky, they'd envisioned dormitories for distant students, advanced classes for graduates, even a circulating library for the broader community. Big dreams, Samuel said as they entered their cabin, expanded now, with a proper bedroom and a nursery for Hope. The right-sized dreams, Eleanor corrected. Dreams that matched the prairie, vast and full of possibility. That night, Eleanor wrote in her journal, the same one where she'd once poured out her anguish at being forced to marry beneath her station. Now her words sang with gratitude and joy. 2 years ago, I thought my life was ending. Forced to marry a servant as punishment, what followed changed everything. But not in the way anyone expected. The punishment became gift. The servant became teacher, husband, father, friend. The marriage became a true partnership, and from our union grew not just love, but a community dedicated to the proposition that every child deserves to learn, regardless of birth or circumstance. Tomorrow, 43 children will ring our school bell. Next year, perhaps 100. The Prairie School stands as testament to the power of choosing hope over fear, community over isolation, love over prejudice. Morrison thought he was teaching the town a lesson about power and place. Instead, he taught us that the most profound changes come from the most unexpected sources. A man who couldn't read became a beloved teacher. A woman raised in privilege found her purpose in serving others. A forced marriage became a chosen love. What follows next? Only God knows. But whatever comes, we'll face it together, Samuel and I, our daughter, our students, our community. We'll face it with words and wisdom, with courage and compassion. We'll face it knowing that sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the harshest trials. The prairie taught us that after the harshest winter comes the most abundant spring. After fire, the most fertile soil. After punishment, the most profound redemption. Tonight, I can hear Samuel reading to Hope, his voice strong and sure. Outside, coyotes call across the grassland, and the wind whispers through our corn. Inside, we are home. Not the home I expected, but the home I chose. The home we built with our own hands, word by word, lesson by lesson, choice by choice. From force to free, from punishment to purpose, from a marriage of circumstance to a love that transforms everything it touches. This is our story, and it's only just beginning. Eleanor closed her journal and went to join her family, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected turns that had led her here. In the circle of lamplight, Samuel looked up from the book he was reading to Hope, his smile saying everything words couldn't capture. Outside, the prairie school stood silent in the darkness, waiting for tomorrow's bells and children's voices. But even in silence, it spoke of hope, of possibility, of the power of education to change not just minds, but entire worlds. The stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their difficult beginning. Now they shone on a family, a school, a community built on the radical idea that everyone deserved the chance to learn and grow and become. From forced marriage to chosen love, from servant to teacher, from punishment to possibility. What followed changed everything. And it was only the beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback and experiences mean the world to us, and I can't wait to hear what this story meant to you.